For the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we're talking about students age 14 until they turn 22 eligible for transition services. And that continues until the IEP team decides that the student can no longer benefit from special education services or the student graduates with a regular high school diploma. So some students with disabilities will decide to graduate after a traditional 4-year high school experience. Their plan is to go on to college or to go on to an adult training program or to get a job. And they'll complete their high school experience in a traditional 4 years and retire, wouldn't that be nice? And graduate with a regular high school diploma at about the age of 18. Some students with disabilities will stay on and they will receive additional transition services and training to meet their transition goals. That's why setting appropriate transition goals can be so critical. Because if the IEP team is deciding graduation questions based on achievement of transition goals, you want to make sure that your transition goals are focused. And we have a national policy of ensuring that those goals, again, focus on independence and self-sufficiency to the maximum extent appropriate for the student. Nessa talked about this last week, but in looking at what are transition services are a coordinated set of activities designed to focus on a results-oriented process that facilitate movement from school-based services to post-secondary services or adult services based upon the individual needs of the child, including, and these are the kinds of services that we often see on transition plans, including instruction, related services, development of post-school objectives. So there we're talking about what kind of ongoing learning opportunities do we want to ensure are available, and acquisition of daily living skills. And when we talk about daily living skills, we're talking about the kinds of skills that are critically important for students to enable them to live in their communities as independently as possible. We're talking about the ability to manage their health care, the ability to manage their meds, the ability to manage their homes, their hygiene. And for some students, that's an area where we have to focus on. For others, that's an area that they have independent skills in and we don't need to focus on. And so within this room, we probably have a wide array of students that are focusing on a traditional 4-year high school experience, will go to college and have very little need in daily living. And we probably have students with very significant disabilities who may need to do ongoing job training still within the school setting until they turn 22, who may need to develop daily living skills in the area of personal hygiene, taking care of their living space, knowing how to do laundry, understanding how to count their medications. They may need support in taking their medication from the container that's been assigned for that day and actually taking it on time. But these are the kinds of skills that we're talking about focusing on. So when we're talking and looking at the transition services plan, we're talking about 4 main sections. The first section of the transition plan is the section that talks about the needs of the child. And that's going to be the age-appropriate transition assessment. And then the next 3 sections are focused on transition services. And we're going to look at transition services under 3 headings. And those 3 headings are post-secondary education and training, employment, and community or independent living. Services include, and I put some additional things on this particular slide, participating in evaluations, doing vocational assessments. We may look at services to connect to public agencies. We may look at services for career training, work-study coordination, job assignments. There is a mistake on this slide that I wanted to point out because it's in your materials. Here it talks about transition services starting at the age of 16. That law was changed, it's actually 14. Your subsequent slides are all correct. This one is not. So if you would make that correction. We now start this process earlier because of the recognition that it's such a critical component to ensuring that students are prepared for adulthood. So let's start at the beginning of the plan where we start to talk about a transition services statement. Here we start to develop the statements when a child turns 14, and we'll have a statement in every subsequent IEP after that. The statement is usually a broad statement that is guided by the self-advocacy of the student and what it is they want to see their future outcome. So when we're talking about results-oriented, we're talking about, does the child want to go to college? Does the child see themselves in a job? What kind of job? What fields of interest has the student demonstrated? Are there strengths of the student that we want to build on? We have a lot of kids that like video games, right? So we have a lot of kids that want to become video game designers. And believe it or not, there is absolutely a legitimate field for that. And if that's where the student's interests lie, we want to give deference to those interests. We also know, right, because we're mom and dad, we also know the likelihood that every kid that wants to be a video game designer is probably not going to do that. And so we look to the team, this is the IEP team, to work together to focus on coaching the student to look at goals that align with their interest, but that may not necessarily be the career that they've envisioned. And part of that through the services process is taking an interest and helping a student research, refine, redefine, and understanding the scope of employment available within that interest. So if you're interested in cars, you can do everything from designing and creating the car and all of its operating systems to repairing cars, doing body work, to selling cars, to understanding how to finance cars. We may want to talk about someone who details cars, cleans cars. What is it about the cars that engages our student at their level of interest? I have a kind of funny story. I had a client once whose favorite thing was to play with the hose, the garden hose. He loved the garden hose. He would stand outside all day long and he would water the garden, and it became just his favorite thing to do. And whenever we talked to him about what he wanted to do as an adult, he wanted to water the garden. There aren't a lot of jobs available for someone to water the garden. But when he discovered the power washer, that was like the garden hose on steroids. He loved the power washer. There is a job for power washing. And his parents took it one step further. They created a company, and he's their chief power washer. And they hired the aide who needed to go with him to support communication and to support the quoting of the jobs. And the aide who is employed by him, and he now owns a power washing company and does as much power washing as he wants to, right? He doesn't want to work full time. That's not his goal. His goal was to work part-time, which is kind of in alignment with his stamina. But he loves his job, and his family supports that. The county board was thrilled. We have someone competitively employed. We have someone making a real living, doing a real job, and someone at a skill level that previously we probably would have relegated to a county board program. So it's those kind of creativity, that kind of not just taking someone's interest and just sort of disregarding it, but really being creative about what that interest is and trying to capture how do we make that a real career. And it's possible. That's the kind of outcome we're looking for. We consider what kind of classes is someone going to need to know in order to achieve that outcome. What sort of post-secondary education is going to be necessary? Other considerations: how do plans for the future mesh with the child's interests? I can tell you that I've been in a lot of IEP meetings with both students and their parents. And when the question comes up to the child, where do you see yourself living in 5 years? The child says, in an apartment with my friends. And mom and dad say, at home with us. Both answers could be right. But if we don't know what we're planning for, we really don't know where to go with that. And so that requires a lot of conversation. And it requires a lot of reality checks. But it's a consideration that the team really needs to work through. And I encourage families all the time to have these conversations before you walk into the IEP meeting. Right? We know that unified fronts help. And if I always use they when it comes to the school district, right? Because some of us have better relationships with our schools than others. But we know that if we're unified, usually we have a better outcome. And so if we're going in having already talked about these things, we can share them more openly. We're not surprised, and it helps. A couple of other considerations that I think are important. What kind of accommodations and services are currently in the IEP that are going to limit our children from achieving self-sufficiency and full independence? And at what point do we want to take a look at some of those accommodations and supports and decide maybe it's time to start fading those? That is a really hard question. But it's an important one to ask, particularly if you're looking at independence, if you're looking at further education, if you're looking at lessening community supports. We don't want to continue to provide so many accommodations, so many supports, that when they graduate and all of that is gone, they're incapable of functioning. And that's hard because we fought for those supports, right? We fought tooth and nail to get that aid. And we don't want to let it go because they're doing well. Sometimes the right answer is to not let it go. But sometimes the right answer is to start to fade and see what we can achieve with a diminished level of support. These are really tough questions, but these are the kinds of considerations that we need to ask ourselves when we do this planning. We also need to ask, can your child describe his or her disability and how it affects his ability or her ability to learn or to perform certain tasks? Do they know how to say to an employer, I need large print, or I need a screen reader on my computer? Do they know why? Do they know why they have a scribe? Can they articulate that? We spend a lot of time protecting our kids sometimes from this process, and transition time is time to engage them in the process. It's time to make sure that they understand these things so that when they get a job, they can say to somebody, I need to take a break so I can test my sugar. And they need to know how to have that conversation. And so if not, we need to get that in the transition plan so that they learn. And we need to be able to advocate for appropriate accommodations We have students accessing church services. And if your child needs the minister to wear amplification in order to hear the church service, they need to be able to ask for that accommodation. If they need a sign language interpreter, if they need to take breaks. I mean, we want to be able to teach our kids how to advocate for themselves when they're at the bank, when they're at the library. And this is the time to really start to look at those things and build them into the plan, so that at age 18, we're not suddenly wondering, is this person ready to be in the community without us? We need to build that, and those are the considerations that we're going to work through.